The real story about America and the media right now is about the voters, about the people who think the media is out to get them, the people who think the media is the enemy of the people, when in fact, media is the people.
Hello and welcome to GZERO World. I'm Ian Bremmer, and today we are looking at the media's role in politics and in democracy itself. Trust in journalism is rapidly eroding, and at the same time, the level of partisanship online is skyrocketing. What impact will all this have on the 2024 election? And how will the first election in the age of generative AI play out? I'll be talking to media experts Brian Stelter and Nicole about that and a lot more. But first, the medium is the message. That's a famous line from one of the first books on media theory, written in 1964 by philosopher Marshall McLuhan. It meant that the way content is delivered can be more powerful than the content itself. Case in point, 4 years before McLuhan's book was published, 70 million Americans tuned in live to the first ever televised presidential debate.
The candidates need no introduction. The Republican candidate, Vice President Richard M. Nixon, and the Democratic candidate, Senator John F. Kennedy.
As the story famously goes, Nixon showed up looking pale, refused makeup, and was sweaty by about 12 minutes into the program.
I believe that we have the secret for progress. We know the way to progress. And I think, first of all, our own record proves that we know the way.
Telegenic was barely a word in 1960, but John F. Kennedy defined it for a generation.
This is a great country, but I think it could be a greater country. And this is a powerful country, but I think it could be a more powerful country.
The polls turned around overnight. Nixon had a thin lead before the debate, but the next day, the advantage went to his tanned and powdered rival. Lyndon B. Johnson, then Kennedy's running mate, was surprised. He thought Nixon had won the debate, but that's probably because LBJ reportedly listened to the debate on the radio. A lot has changed since the early days of television, a 24/7 cable news cycle, hyper-partisan talk shows on the radio. Do you remember Rush Limbaugh? Scores of political podcasts and the endless doom scroll of social media have created an information and disinformation overload. It's impacting trust in the media. According to a Gallup poll, journalists rank just above car salespeople, members of Congress, and telemarketers on the list of mistrusted professionals. Shout out to nurses, though, a well-deserved first place. Trust in the media is so low that half of Americans surveyed believe news organizations are deliberately trying to mislead them, present company excluded, obviously, and some major recent developments are doing little to help the cause. Fox News settled a defamation case brought by Dominion Voting Systems for $787 million. Fox then canned Tucker Carlson, a chief perpetuator of the big lie that voter fraud cost Donald Trump the 2020 election. And that, of course, was fake news. More recently, a U.S. district judge in Louisiana prohibited agencies in the Biden administration from pressuring social media companies. A lawsuit claimed that officials frequently tried to squash stories about things like COVID vaccine safety, election integrity, and Hunter Biden's infamous laptop. These examples give politicians in the United States a bogeyman to point to and say, "See, I told you so." But media is also taking a trip to the upside-down world these days. CNN hosted a controversial town hall with GOP frontrunner Donald Trump.
That was a rigged election, and it's a shame that we had to go through it.
And Elon Musk invited Tucker Carlson to host a show on Twitter.
UFOs are actually real, and apparently so is extraterrestrial life.
As if the media landscape weren't already littered with landmines as we head into another election, along comes this.
You know, people might be surprised to hear me say this, but I actually like Ron DeSantis a lot. Yeah, I know. I'd say he's just the kind of guy this country needs, and I really mean that.
No, she doesn't, because she never said it, except maybe late at night to Bill just to annoy him. That was an AI-generated deep fake video, one of, unfortunately, thousands that we will be exposed to over the course of this campaign. This will be the first presidential election in the age of generative AI, and the potential for pitfalls is enormous. If Marshall McLuhan were around today, I wonder if he'd come to the same conclusion that the medium is the message. Maybe now it's more like the message is all that matters if enough people believe it. And here to talk about all of this are two of the greatest minds on the matter. Self-proclaimed media nerd Brian Stelter is a journalist and former host of CNN's Reliable Sources. And Nicole Hemmer is a political historian and expert in partisan media. Brian Stelter, thanks for joining us today.
Great to be here. Thanks.
And Nicole Hemmer in Nashville. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so lots to talk about today. I want to start because when I was a tiny kid, Walter Cronkite was the most trusted man in America. Today, the media is very, very, very far from that. What happened?
I think the word trust is the key word. The war on truth that was seen during the Trump years and continues to this day is really more than a war on truth. It's a war on trust. But I think trust has been eroding for decades. It's a generation-long event. Trump is just in some ways a dramatized part of it. This war on trust, it was underway in the 70s and 80s in some parts of the Republican Party. It was advantageous to the Republican Party to try to create an alternative to the mainstream media, an alternative to the Walter Cronkites. We see that with Fox News in the 90s, but also with the rise of talk radio, and then to some extent the rise of alternative social networks that's happening now. So what we see is a fragmenting, right, from the big three networks to dozens and to hundreds and to thousands, now to millions. And in that environment, trust has collapsed.
And nobody watches the same thing anymore, right? I mean, so it's not just a question of left versus right, but it's also there's no common narrative in the media, where when there were three big networks, there really were. Nicole, how did that happen, and how problematic is or isn't that for civil society?
Well, it comes from a lot of different sources. Of course, back in the 50s and 60s, conservatives were making the argument that you shouldn't watch liberal media. You should only trust conservative sources and only watch those. And that comes into connection with a big change that happens in the media in the 80s and 90s with the rise of cable. And that fragmentation of the media dial and that sort of fragmentation of the audience has an enormous effect on a kind of shared culture, shared information. So part of it is technological, right? Technology changes, cable, then the internet and social media allows you to kind of curate what you're watching more. It also gives rise to a kind of desire to make news more entertaining. And that emphasis on entertainment as the way of consuming news, that also changes what people expect from news, the kind of news that they're drawn to. It changes news values in really important ways that helps to contribute to that erosion in trust that Brian was talking about. And it really does matter because that lack of shared information, shared understanding does lead to a fragmentation of the culture, one that is, again, both technological, but also coming from the right, really purposeful as a way of getting their audiences to trust them more than other sources.
Now, Nicole, frequently, I mean, I read the New York Times, I read the Wall Street Journal, and frequently the stories I will see are very, very similar. The headlines that I consume are radically different. How intentional is that in your view? What's happening between the meat and the headline?
Oh, it's absolutely intentional. And part of it is because there is this desire to get people to actually click. If you can elicit enough shock from someone when they see the headline, then chances are they will at least click through to see what's going on. And this is part of how media have changed during a social media age. But it's not just about social media. I mean, newspapers have been going for grabby headlines in order to goose sales for well over 100 years. So that's not necessarily new. I don't know that the New York Times and Wall Street Journal editors, as they're working on their headlines, are aiming to mislead their readers. I mean, they want to be trusted by their readers. It's just when you get that set of journalistic values coming up against that set of business interests that you sometimes get some of these misleading headlines and that kind of clickbait that has made readers, I don't know, a little more suspicious of newspapers, a little more wary of clicking through because they don't know whether they should trust the headline actually matches the story.
Which leads to the question on Trump, right? Because of course, so much of Trump in 2016 was the media just throwing him in every possible headline. Guy's an incredible showman. He's a marketer, aware of his brand like almost no one the American public has ever seen. But then when he runs for president, suddenly, like, he is literally getting wall-to-wall coverage on CNN's morning show, on Morning Joe. Whether or not they like him or hate him, it's just wall-to-wall coverage. How did you deal with that? Did you feel, first of all, did you feel complicit? Did you feel culpable? Like, as this is happening, and certainly at the beginning, you must be thinking to yourself, this guy has no chance, doesn't matter, but it's a fun story.
Well, more importantly, Republicans thought that. Remember, the Sean Spicers of the world thought Trump had no chance.
That's right.
Trump was, from the outset, one of the biggest stories of our lifetime. Even if he had lost in 2016, he would still be a gigantic earthquake within the Republican Party. So I think it's important to recognize how newsworthy he was, and to this day still is. Now, that said, the ways that he is covered make a big difference. Whether he is scrutinized, whether questions are skeptical, whether there are appropriate follow-ups, all of that matters. But I don't think it matters as much as people sometimes want it to matter. What I mean by that is, at the end of the day, there is an alternative universe, a Republican media operation led by Fox that was driving Donald Trump's success. He was calling in not just to CNN, but to Fox. Fox was propping him up every single day. So to the extent that, if it as a thought experiment, if the rest of the American media had ignored Donald Trump in 2016, I don't think it would have mattered. He had the right-wing media in his pocket. And this country is split up now into two competing media universes. I think it is completely, almost entirely separated at this point. I think what we have to reckon with is the reality that if one arm of the American media is doing the fact-checking, that actually might strengthen and enhance some of these demagogues, some of these populist candidates. And that is a challenge I don't know the way out of. It came up with recently with the CNN town hall with Trump. CNN was widely denounced for having a town hall with Trump. There was an argument that it made him even bigger and more popular among the Republican Party. But is the answer not to question the candidate? It's just we're in this paradoxical moment where questioning the candidate, fact-checking, scrutinizing him, sometimes makes him stronger.
I mean, he can't be fact-checked in real time, right? I mean, this is something that we saw, during that town hall that I'm going to ask you about in a second, Brian. How do you handle that in real time?
Oh, it's a great question, because you're exactly right. Like, if you're bringing facts to an ideology fight, you're just playing on different fields. So you're both getting something out of it, right? Caitlin Collins gets to look tough for constantly pushing back and fact-checking Donald Trump, and Donald Trump gets all of this airtime to spew all sorts of untruths and message to his base. I mean, one of the things that you would want to do differently, I think, is have a different audience if you were going to have any audience at all. Obviously, with the town hall, you have to have an audience. To have it so thoroughly stacked with Trump supporters and other Republicans, I think, creates an atmosphere in which Donald Trump is going to thrive, in which fact-checking is going to fail. But there is something about that interview format, any kind of live format with Donald Trump, I think, is going to be a failure in a way, because it just allows him to steamroll, and there's very little that you can do to push back and actually, stop spreading misinformation in real time.
But also, I mean, the guy's running a business, Chris Licht, at the time, and Donald Trump is the brand. And it's not like he's saying, oh, okay, you don't want to have Republicans in the audience? Sure, I'm willing to do it with a neutral audience. I'm willing to do it with no audience. He's going to say no. He's going to say, you're either doing it my way or I'm not giving it to you. What do you do in that situation?
Trump had all the leverage, but there is still a choice about whether to platform him or not. That is always a choice. It's a choice now about Robert Kennedy Jr. and his claims about vaccines. There is always a choice about whether to platform or not. I do err on the side of presenting these broadcasts, maybe not live, but presenting them and letting the viewers see who these people are and who these candidates are. We need to hear so much more from voters, and frankly, so much less from these politicians that are pandering to them. Because the real story about America and the media right now is about the voters, about the people who think the media is out to get them, the people who think the media is the enemy of the people, when in fact, media is the people. The person I trust most in the media is the local editor of the paper closest to my hometown. I sometimes wonder if when people complain about the media, what they're really complaining about is the existence of the politician the media is covering. And I do think there's an element of that that's going on here when it comes to some of these far-right candidates, and to some extent, maybe a candidate like RFK Jr., who is putting pollution into the information ecosystem.
So Nicole, I'm hearing from Brian, it's not the media's fault. No part of it, right?
Not entirely.
What I think we need is much more analysis, right? That's the way to cover somebody like Marjorie Taylor Greene, is to bring in experts to talk about what it is she believes and why she's so popular, why she is this kind of mainstream in a way, or at least huge national figure, despite representing a very small district. Why does she get so much outsized attention? And what does that mean? What are people responding to? What do supporters of Marjorie Taylor Greene think? And how can you address the kinds of things that they're going to her for? And there are some things that you can't do, right? Like if people are entertained by or interested in conspiracies about Jewish space lasers, there's very little you can do about that. But you can go into those conspiracies, explain the kind of work that they're doing. And that's probably not as entertaining as interviewing Marjorie Taylor Greene. It might not bring in the same kind of ratings. And that becomes the kind of push-pull that's happening in journalism right now, is how do you do that kind of analysis in a way that satisfies audiences without necessarily platforming some of the most odious people in the country who, again, you don't actually need to talk to Marjorie Taylor Greene at this point to know what she believes. She has been on countless platforms saying exactly that. So moving the conversation beyond just what Marjorie Taylor Greene believes or says to some of the broader dynamics around her.
And before we close, I want to ask about disinformation, and I want to ask specifically about artificial intelligence. 2024 election coming up, we've already seen AI-generated photos, tapes, audio, as well as video. What do you think needs to happen? What do you think the implications are that you've seen so far of that trend?
I'm an optimist by nature, but I'm a pessimist when it comes to this topic, because it does seem to me the energy around defeating disinformation, policing, guarding against it, that energy is evaporated. I think AI is going to supercharge this, of course, make it a lot easier to have a lot more information pollution in the atmosphere, and that pollution does choke everybody. I think the danger is it causes people to decide, I just don't know what's true, I can't decide what's true anymore, I can't figure it out, I'm just going to tune out, check out, I'm just going to drop out and not participate in the American conversation. That is the real danger of this environment of disinformation and of politicians peddling propaganda. But I never buy this idea that we're in a post-truth society, though, because we're only in a post-truth society if we all give up, like if we all surrender. You know, there are many, many, many millions of Americans out there defending the truth in all their individual ways. Some go out and they launch Substacks, they launch blogs, they launch newsletters, they post on Facebook or Nextdoor and educate their neighbors about what's going on in their world. There are all of those little green shoots out there that make me hopeful about this media environment. But where I do feel pessimism is about disinformation and AI, because it is going to make a bad problem even worse in the short term.
And Nicole, it is a spectrum, right? I mean, I'm not saying it's wholly post-truth, but my God, there's a lot of elements of post-truth out there. Where do you come down?
I join Brian in his pessimism about this. I mean, it requires so much attention and media literacy in order to parse what's true and not true. And as Brian was saying, like, you find then like one voice out there who you can really trust, and you subscribe to their Substack, and we become even more and more atomized as news consumers because there is so much distrust out there. I do think that many people don't want to be post-truth. They want to know what is real in the world, and they want to use what is real to guide the choices that they make. It's just so much more difficult than it used to be. Not that there was a golden age or a nirvana where everybody had easy access to true facts and the ability to sort through them easily, but that we are in a particular flood of misinformation and disinformation right now, and the tools for navigating that are just not as strong as we would like them to be. And so maybe that's the next big project. Maybe that's where we'll see those green shoots, is as people innovate ways to make it easier to navigate a world that's awash in this kind of disinformation.
But this new AI crisis, it makes old news outlets even more important, even more impactful, I think. Real news outlets should verify or debunk the nonsense on the internet and tell people what is true. And what I'm hoping is that in an environment that's going to be overwhelmed by AI-empowered disinformation, there's going to be a little bit of a walled garden of real news outlets that you can actually enter that garden and feel like you not always can trust every bit of it, but can have more confidence in it.
Nicole Hemmer, Brian Stelter, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.
That's our show this week. Come back next week, and if you like what you see, or even if you don't, but you're like, hey, how about beating up some more on mainstream media? We've got you covered. Take a minute to sign up for our most excellent morning newsletter. It's called GZERO Daily.